Okay. So welcome everyone. My name is Melissa Petrangelo Scaia. I'm the Director of International Training at Global Rights for Women. I also do Batterers Intervention Program direct service work. I do 2 groups a week. I've been doing that through video conference since January 2019 as part of a research project. When we started that, we had no idea that COVID would happen, just like the rest of you. So our research actually finished in March of 2020. We did that for 15 months, and so that's become real timely. We have Scott Miller here. We're going to have him introduce himself in just a moment, but I'm going to have Nazifa come on first, and then I'll just say a few more things about myself, and we'll have Scott introduce himself, and we'll go from there. So Nazifa?
Yeah, hi everyone. I am the program coordinator here at Global Rights for Women, and my name is Nazifa. And we're just going to go through some webinar logistics real quick. So as you join the webinar, please keep your microphones muted and your webcam shut off, and please ensure that your cell phones are muted as well. And if you have any questions or technical issues, please feel free to type them into the chat box throughout the presentation, and the moderators will take those questions throughout the webinar from the chat box. And just so you all know, a recording of the presentation will be sent to all of you who have registered for the webinar.
Great, thank you, Nazifa.
Yeah, and just to touch on Global Rights for Women, we are a nonprofit based here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we work with leaders from around the world to advance women and girls' human right to live free from violence, and we do that through legal reform and institutional and social change. Thanks.
Great. So I introduced myself just to say a little bit more. Scott and I have also done quite a bit of expert witness testimony and done that. Maybe we should talk about that in a future webinar, Scott. We can talk about that, but he and I also do that work. But I also like to remind Scott, especially when I'm here and in front of all of you, that I used to be Scott's boss at the Domestic Abuse Intervention Programs in Duluth. I just want you to know I was very unsuccessful bossing Scott around. He was not very compliant when I was his boss, but Scott now has my position in Duluth at the Duluth Model. And so there'll be times where I'm going to be asking Scott some things and adding some things, but Scott's kind of our main presenter, but in part just because I've done that role. I've been there, and Scott and I worked together. He was most certainly the leader on the Blueprint for Safety project in Duluth. And one of the most fascinating projects I worked on with Scott while we were there was looking at, I remember, the juvenile domestic assault project, which is some of that's included in the Blueprint as well. But Scott, let's have you introduce yourself.
Hi, well, my name is Scott Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the Domestic Abuse Intervention Programs. I've worked for the agency for 20 years. I've done men's programming for all of that time. And been really responsible for most of my time at the agency for coordinating Duluth's coordinated response to domestic violence, which we're going to talk about today. So glad to be with you, and it's an honor to speak with you all.
Great. So Nazifa's going to change the slides for us then. So Scott, if you want to go to Nazifa, go to that first one, and Scott, just let her know when you want her to change it. And then remember that you can type questions in the chat box, and if it's relevant in the moment, I will stop Scott then. Otherwise, we'll just keep those till the end, and I'll keep note of them. So go ahead, Scott.
All right, thank you. So just as a way to start, the Duluth model is a way in which we organize. It's a method of organizing. It's not the power and control wheel. It's not our men's program. It's not our police policy. It's how all of those things were organized. So our coordinated community response, what's behind it is really this method of organizing, which one of the mainstays of it is to ensure that when government systems intervene in the lives of victims and offenders, that they do it in a way that makes it safer for victims and easier to hold offenders accountable. And part of the way we do that is to shift institutions so that they're taking up the lived experience and what victims need, as opposed to making victims line up with what the system wants or what the system needs. And so, so yeah, for any of you who do that work, obviously that's not easy work to do, but that's really from our vantage point what a victim-centered response looks like, is when systems take up the lived experience of victims as their way to organize their responses. Next slide, please. So what we end up organizing is a coordinated community response. So there's as many definitions of what a coordinated response is as there are probably places that do it. We mean something quite specific by it. So when we're talking about a coordinated response, we're not talking about good relationships. We're not talking about people who meet at a table once a month. What we're talking about is, like I said, finding out from when this agency is called by a victim to intervene, say law enforcement. What is it that law enforcement does that is helpful? What is it that law enforcement does that is not helpful, that does not improve your safety? We get those things as agenda items as organizers, and we go back and we start working with those agencies to reform practice so that the practice lines up more with what the victim needs. And then once we have an idea of what it is that we want that agency to do, then we institutionalize that practice in policy and protocols. Policy meaning this is directing the worker to do something. The protocol tells the worker how to do it. And so both of those things are crucial in a coordinated response. And when each agency, from the initial call that she makes to the emergency phone like 911 is in our country, and then law enforcement shows up, and then the courts, and then other intervening agencies, all of those policies and protocols have a way of interlinking so that the work of the next agency is actually enhanced by the previous agency. And that then ends up being what we refer to as coordinated. And really one of the main points that one of the main goals that we hope is that when we do that, it changes the climate of tolerance in the community for this kind of crime. So when we have guys who come into our men's program and refer to Duluth as Mississauga as a sarcastic response, that's telling me that they're feeling something different when they're in our community. When they lived in another community, they might have been treated very differently when they were violent to women. But when you come to this one, we are not going to tolerate it, and we will be relentless in going after you for this particular crime. And we want them to know that.
Yeah,
Next
so
slide.
Scott, I think, one thing just to say about that is that in many parts of the world, sometimes the terms multidisciplinary team and CCR get used interchangeably, and we're not interchanging those here, just to be clear. That from our experience in Duluth, that a multidisciplinary team is one thing that got created by the coordinated community response, but it is not the coordinated community response, just because we have some international audience members here.
Yeah, in the United States, multidisciplinary team means a collection of people who meet and talk about problems that they're having executing their jobs and how things need to maybe possibly change. What's not happening are people changing their policies and protocols with community advocates. That's a whole different approach. All right, next slide, please. All right, so one of the things we're doing in a CCR is making the violence visible. And so one of the things you see with risk tools is that they hone down, they take a numerical, statistical factor that is relevant to this offender group using this kind of violence, like say stalking or strangulation or threats to kill. And then they boil it down to a checkbox or some number that comes out on that individual to demonstrate their risk. One of the things that we have pushed back on in relation to that is that can be helpful as one factor in making an overall evaluation of an offender's risk, but we need the context of her life also. We need to put those risk factors into context. One of the things that I hear repeatedly from government agencies is that I don't want to know that this person threatened to kill her. I want to know how he threatened to kill her. Did he just walk out the door because he was angry and said, I should have killed you? Or did he write her extensive letters about how he was going to kill her and hide her body so that nobody could find it? Because as a judge speaking to me, they're saying, I want to know that guy versus this guy, because that helps me make decisions about what conditions should be on his release after he's been arrested. So they don't just want the score, they want the context, and that makes her life visible to the system, which is crucial, we think, in a well-functioning CCR. And it brings judgment down, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But the more that you can expose who he is and what he's been doing, whether it relates to risk factors or just abusive behavior, it helps people understand why victims may not leave when they think she should, because they see how dangerous he is. All right.
So Scott, one of the things, can you just say a little bit, maybe we'll talk about it here too, but you know, part of the feedback we got from this afternoon's webinar we did is just how hard is it right now and during the COVID time of doing CCR to make the violence visible, you know, in terms of coordinating that? Are there been particular challenges that you faced trying to coordinate things? Could you maybe give an example or two about that?
Well, okay, so if we had, right, so in Duluth, we have a way where a domestic violence response team, which is made up of one of our staff, each of the shelter have a staff on that team, and then 2 investigators and a sergeant, they make up the core aspect of that team. When our government locked down everybody, people had to start working from home. And law enforcement had these shifts where even command are now on the street patrolling. And there were pods of 8 officers that would work for 5 days and then be off for 18. So there's nobody left in the offices to call. So what we had to do is I called a lieutenant who's a lieutenant of the divert team. And I said, we got to find a way to get those police reports to our employee who's at home so she can do the risk files and send them to the court before his first appearance in court, which then dictates his pretrial release conditions. And that took some time. The difference in Duluth, though, because we've been doing this for so long, is that we didn't have to convince them that this was important. We just had to talk to them about how to reorganize what we were already doing. Now, if we didn't have this in place, it would be extremely difficult. And in Duluth, it would be probably nearly impossible, given the staffing, for us to coordinate something new. So we were, it just goes to show for us, and it was a lesson to us because we've not lived through anything like this in our lifetimes, how important it is to have these relationships and these protocols and policies in place prior to something happening that is a crisis such as that we're in now, because then it's just moving chess pieces around as opposed to trying to convince somebody to play the game in the first place. Everybody in Duluth believed this is extremely important. We just got to find a way to do it. And that made it possible.
Right, and I think, Scott, now would be the time to also have you mention that when you say that Duluth, you know, is organized and made it a priority, even just say a little bit about what the police chief had done in Duluth and about sort of making a public statement about it, I think is sort of testament to just saying to the public about the importance of this crime in particular.
Yeah, so Chief Tuscan, who is our police chief in Duluth, he, right when the governor locked things down, as a statement to the community about how the police will be conducting themselves during lockdown, the one crime that he mentioned that they will continue to respond to are domestic violence cases. To let everybody know that we may be cutting back on responding to lower level kinds of disturbances, but we will not cut back on how we're going to respond to domestic violence. And yesterday, each of these different agencies produced a video and sent to the city of Duluth, who are now putting all of these very short pieces out from the shelters, from the police, from probation, from DEIP, sending a message to the community about if you're a victim, for example, and you need help, we are here ready to help. Police, we are going to respond if you call. DEIP, if you're somebody who's struggling using violence against your family, here's a number you can call and a skilled facilitator will call you back. We're not getting the calls. Our calls are way down. Our protective order requests are way down. Calls to shelter are way down. And what we think is that there's just no space for women living with an abusive partner to get out, to make a call, to ask for help. And so we're reinforcing as a community that we are ready when you are to help. So it's one of the things that we're doing. And it just goes to show that, again, he's the one who called me with the idea, the police chief, which goes to how important everybody takes this issue in our community.
Yeah, I'm, friends with some really good family law attorneys, and I was talking to them today, and one of the interesting things they said is that their number of intakes for divorce per day are much higher than they ever had. Maybe in a week they get 1 or 2 calls. They're getting 1, 2, 3, 4 calls a day now to talk about divorce, and that in a way that they've never before. So in part what I was talking to them about is to finding out if any of those underlying issues are tied to, domestic violence at all. And they said that they know that most certainly they are.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks, guys.
So understanding risk to victims. So here's an interesting dilemma that happens with some of the risk tools. So the risk tools are focused heavily on whether an offender is going to reoffend or if they are potentially lethal. And interestingly, that's what the system wants to know. Is this person going to end up back in my docket? Is this person going to be somebody I have to go back to the house time and again, right? I want to know those kinds of pieces of information. But for a victim, there's a lot of different sources of risk that she is contending with. And the problem with focusing simply on reoffense and lethality is it makes her life, in some sense, disappear. You're not going to understand a victim's experience by understanding his risky behaviors, because she's dealing with so much more than that. So one of the examples that I can give you is that we were working in a community where law enforcement would come out to the house, and what the women in the focus group said is that in our town, you get 1 shot at the police. I said, what does that mean? And they said, well, when the police come out, they'll arrest him, but they let us know before they leave that if I don't get out, the next time they have to come to this house, I'm going to be the one arrested. So we don't get multiple calls in our community to the police. Now that's a risk factor to her, because it further isolates her from the resources and help that she could get, right? So now she has to contend with an institutional risk by calling the police. So she's weighing that. Or maybe she's weighing that she's got 4 children and the risk is, okay, maybe I want to leave or maybe I can leave, but can I get out and stay out? Because if I fail to support myself and my kids when I get out, I'm going to end up back in the home with him, and that's going to be really bad, right? Or he has the car, or all the money's in his name, or there's just so many different things that victims are contending with that when we only focus on reoffense and lethality, in some sense, she disappears. And as a woman in a focus group that I'll never forget, said to me, was whatever, we were talking to her about different interventions we were thinking of implementing, and she said, whatever interventions you do, you can't lose sight of the power he has over me and all the ways that that plays out. Because the minute you lose sight of that, you lose sight of me. Because I don't have a moment that I get to not account for what he can do and all the different ways that he can abuse me, than other than his physical violence. So we are trying to find ways of doing risk evaluations as opposed to risk scores. The scores are one component, but we have a more of an array of information for the practitioners to review and make both decisions that are based on a mathematical score and ones that are made from the subjective professionalism of the person in that position. And we'll talk more about how we position people to do that as this goes. Next slide, please. So this illustration is really a good one because it's so helpful in seeing all the different ways that a victim has to weigh risk. So you see batterer-generated risks at the bottom. In the United States, batterer is a term for somebody using ongoing coercion and violence against their intimate partner and children. So that's what those lethality scores are trying to measure, his risk. But what they don't take up are the institutional risks for her calling for help. So it's the third time she's called and child protection comes in and starts suggesting that she's failing to protect her kids and threatening to take her kids from her. That's a risk now that she has to weigh. Or she can't get her kids back because she can't get away from him. But the government system is blaming her for not leaving, right? The immediate circumstances. A lot of women talk about how am I just going to organize what I need to have in place so that I can get out and stay out, and I don't have to come back because everything's in his name. I just dealt with a case on Friday where probation called and they said, we've got a high-risk guy. She's scared. We need some help thinking through how to respond to this. And what he had done is that she had $500 that she got from the government, and he took it and put it in his account and wouldn't give it back to her. And she had no money and she had no place to go. So that was an immediate circumstance that we had to find a way. We can replace the money, and we can get you a housing if you want to leave. Now, this particular woman decided to stay, even though we took away the barriers of money and housing for the moment. But she's thinking about what she wants to do going forward, and she set up with the probation agent a fake Facebook account. The agent did, and they're now friends on Facebook. And if the victim sends a particular word to the probation agent that's her code word, then that means that the agent's to call 911 immediately and get law enforcement over there. So in that intervention, we gave a woman the opportunity to leave with the agents under escort and create a safety plan when she decided to stay. That's an example of trying to take up both the batterer generator risk, the institutional responses, and the immediate circumstances, and try to account for those things. And then aspects of culture. We did a project for a number of years with the evangelical Christian community in our area. And one of the things we learned when we talked to the women who were experiencing the abuse in those homes was that they didn't call the government for help. They called their pastors for help. And when the pastors intervened in these cases after they'd been assaulted, they weren't intervening in a way that was making it safer for her. In fact, they were intervening in a way that actually made it more dangerous for her. That wasn't the pastor's intent, but that was the impact of their interventions. So that made it difficult for the women to access help. And you see where this theme of isolation, which is one of his tactics, isolating her to keep her from all those contacts, that when the system acts in ways that isn't helpful to her, it further isolates her and makes it actually easier for the offender to do what he's doing. And so, again, when systems are solely focused on his risk scores, his lethality, his reoffense, they lose sight of how they as a system are actually making it more difficult for her to access and making it easier for the abuser to do what they're doing when they don't take up all of these different ways that she has to take up of risk. All right, next slide, please.
So Scott, there's a couple of questions, and one of which is kind of relevant. So if you could go back now, just for a second, is a couple of people have said that they've had some challenges making contact with women, at this time, and they're not been very successful. And do you have any other ways to protect women when contacting them privately? Like you gave the example of how the probation officer, created that fake Facebook account to contact her with. I know for myself, but I've talked to a number of agencies where they've gotten their staff some, like the month-to-month phones, so some cell phones, so that if you were to call back and check that number, it's just, a random name. So if you were to call back, it wouldn't be, like Melissa Scaia, who works for Global Rights for Women, which would be problematic if you heard that. So I know that that's one thing that some staff that I've talked to who are working from home trying to reach out for women, that their agencies got them some cell phones in order to communicate with them. But do you have any other examples, Scott, about how you're making contact with victims during this time, during COVID?
Yeah, so we're having the same struggle, and I think this is a very common experience around the world right now, is that because of the lockdown and because his presence is so close to hers, it's hard to know, as an advocate, should I call? Am I going to make it worse? And then if you do, can she even talk to you? And what we're hearing from probation agents is that it's very hard for victims to have any conversations with agents under this lockdown. They're not getting a lot of information from them. They don't really want to talk to the agent, which is different than what the agents were experiencing prior. So one of the things we did, we have this men's program. We have about 100 some guys in the program currently. So we called all the guys, and we got about a 50% response rate. So about 50 of the guys responded. And we just asked them to give us some answers to a list of 10 questions. And one of the questions was, do you live alone? And it really helped us figure out which of the guys that we are now dealing with are not living with a partner. And so we've got that group of names of women that we know now that we can call, and we don't have to contend with his presence. And then what we're going to do with that is talk through with those women about how we should be contacting the women who are still with their partners, giving us some direction and advice on what we should be doing. Again, that's a victim-centered way of going about it, rather than just deciding as experts that we've been doing this for 20, 25, 30 years. We should know how to do this. We don't. And if you're not going back to the women you serve to ask them how to do this, inevitably you're going to make a mistake. You're going to have an unintended consequence because there's things you're going to miss that a victim won't.
Right. Thanks, Scott.
All right. So designing a method for risk evaluation. So these are the questions that we asked ourselves back in about 2006 when we started putting this together in Duluth. So who's going to collect the data? used for both context and risk. And we had a lot of different conversations about that, but what we settled on the answer to that was law enforcement. We know that when a woman calls for help, the first responder is going to get the most information from that victim about not only what's happened to her, but what it's like to live with him. And so law enforcement in Duluth are asked to collect a lot at the scene. And again, what I'm describing here of how we did it, I don't want to give the impression that that's how everybody should do it, because our decisions were made based on resource allocation in our community. If you go to our website, and you'll see it at the end of the slideshow, we have all of our policies and protocols for all of our criminal justice agencies on the website. So you can see in the police protocol all the different things that they are asked to collect at the scene. So our police reports are 8 to 20 pages long on a single domestic assault call. That's a lot of, we're asking a lot of our officers to collect a tremendous amount at the scene so that the rest of us can make the kind of decisions that we need to. Now, the reason we do that is because there's an interesting gap that just naturally happens in a community where you've got law enforcement who are asked to arrest on a standard of probable cause, which is a very low standard of proof. That report that they produce now becomes the product for a prosecutor to take this to court, and if they have to prove their case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest burden of proof. So what we've asked our officers to do to get rid of this gap is to collect information to what we would say is to beyond a reasonable doubt standard. So you're going to interview all the witnesses, you're going to get all their names, you're going to ask specific questions of victims, you're going to ask specific questions of offenders, and you're going to notate all of that in a report, and you're going to send that to the prosecutor, positioning that prosecutor to be able to prosecute that case in a much better position than they would if you just sent them a probable cause report that said, I came in, I determined probable cause for an arrest, I made the arrest, and I left. That's not an easy case to prosecute. So officers are already doing a lot. We did not want them to do a risk evaluation at the scene, but we want them to collect the context and risk information from the victim. And then we organized a way to analyze, which is the second bullet there. How is it going to be analyzed after that? So one of our employees shows up at the police department every morning at 6:30 a.m. And for everybody who's arrested on a domestic assault, she downloads that police report and she organizes the information in that report, again, 8 to 20 pages long, organizes it in a way that other agencies can take up in an efficient manner. And every agency gets a different version of what we send because they are using it for different reasons when they get it. So that goes to the third bullet. Well, how will it be organized on need? The judges told us they don't have a lot of time. They've got umpteen arraignments for the morning, first appearances, and they need to make quick decisions about what the pretrial release conditions are going to be for this offender. So we had to work with our bench a lot to figure out what that form should look like and what should be on it. And you're going to get a copy of that framework from Melissa after the slideshow, so you'll see what form we use. But they get it differently than what the city attorney's office. The city attorney's office, what they get is different than what the county attorneys get. So everybody gets it in a different way because they have a different way of intervening in this case. When you're organizing for risk, you just don't want somebody to do a risk thing and then everybody has to find a way to use it. Most of the work is not the tool. Most of the work is figuring out how to make that tool relevant to everybody else's work in an efficient and timely manner. That's the real organizing piece. And then how is it going to get distributed to all the practitioners? How is it going to get from this agency to this agency routinely so that that doesn't fall through the cracks? And again, we're going to talk more about that coming up, but that's fundamentally these 4 bullets. For us, were about 2 years of work. That's how long it took us to figure out. Even though we had the answer, we had to figure out how to do it. And that's really, to me, the crux of organizing around risk. It's not the tool, it's how you put it together in a community. Next slide, please. So let's start with data collection. First responders are typically positioned to gather, so that's who they were. They were going to be law enforcement, and they were going to collect risk information, and they were going to collect context. And it was going to be done with a set of questions that you're going to see in a moment. They're not going to fill anything out other than type up the responses that the victims give, and document that so that somebody else can analyze it for risk. Community-based advocates are obviously, having worked in an advocacy field for as long as I have, we can develop good trusting relationships with victims, but we're not going to do it as quickly as law enforcement's going to. And the other thing that's interesting, and I've been on a project where multiple, like about 10 agencies all got releases from the women they were working with. And we picked 5 women to look at their lives through these different agencies. And so when we had all the releases, we all brought what we knew about that victim. And of course, as advocates, we thought we knew the most. But the interesting thing was when all these different agencies put into the middle of the table what they knew, we saw this pattern where victims were working in the community to say, okay, that agency needs to know this from me, so I'm going to tell them this much of my story because that's what they need to know. And this agency is going to help me with this, and this is what I'm going to tell them because that's what they need to know. And so all of us knew things about the victims that others didn't know. And so that's a piece where advocates weren't going to be the ones who produced this, mostly because the victims told us, the women told us that they did not want their advocate to be the one conveying information to the criminal justice system. So again, law enforcement ended up being that filter to push all of this information out to the system from the scene. So those were our data collection point. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are the questions that law enforcement ask.
Wait, sorry, 1 second. Sorry, there's a question here. I just want to get, just because you just mentioned it, about the policing sort of the point of entry to get the information. And there's a question about how do you get them to do it, right? Like, how do you make sure that they actually do it? Because there are other cities, I even know just in Minnesota, where they have, resources, they have, they have risk tools, they have all this stuff, but then some of the officers do it, some of they don't, right? And so how do they make them do it? So just one way I just know that you haven't mentioned yet is part of it is the dictation device, right? They're not typing it all. They're having somebody clean that up after. So that helps in terms of the collection of the data. But what if a police officer didn't do it? Would there be accountability for it if they didn't?
Right, so anytime that you're organizing, so I talked about organizing policy and protocols. If what you're asking a government agency to do is not in their policy, the likelihood that they're going to do it or do it consistently is low because they're held to the policy. They're not held to a handshake. So the first thing is that you need to institutionalize it in policy, but then simultaneously you have to build in mechanisms of supervision to ensure that people are doing what they're supposed to do. So in Duluth, the Duluth Police Department, the St. Louis County Sheriff's Department, when they produce a domestic violence report, there are going to be 5 people who read that every single morning. There is not, all the officers know, there is not a report that they will produce that will be scrutinized more tightly than their domestic assault reports. So they know that if they skip something, if they don't do something they were supposed to, a phone call is going to get made from their commanding officer, because that's where it's going to go. And so our compliance rate to those questions that we were asked, that I did on the next slide, our compliance rate to asking those questions is in the mid 90 percentile, because there's just no room to not follow the policy. But again, it needs to be policy, but you also have to have supervision mechanisms built in to every policy that you have if you want them to be followed. So law enforcement goes to the scene, they secure it, and then they start doing their interviews. Typically, one officer interviews the offender or alleged offender, and the other officer interviews the alleged victim. And the one who's interviewing the victim is going to ask, if it's intimate partner domestic assault, they are going to ask all of these questions. And just to give you an idea of a mistake that we made, an unintended consequence, because we didn't go to the women on all of these questions. If you read the very last question there, has he or she ever forced you to do things sexually you didn't want to? The original way that the advocates who got together and recommended to the police department how that should be phrased was, has he or she ever coerced you to do things sexually you didn't want to? And after the police started asking that question, we were reviewing police reports and we weren't seeing anybody ever answer that question. Yet advocates were hearing all the time how much sexual coercion was a part of their lives from these men who batter. And so we were perplexed. We didn't know why that was. So we did what we should have done in the first place. We got a focus group of women together. It was actually, I think, a women's advisory group. So they were an ongoing group that we go to ask questions of. And we said, we told them what we had done. We told them how we did it. And we gave them the language. And we said, would this be a question you would ask? You would answer if a police officer asked you? And the first question a woman asked was, what does coerced mean? And it was like, yeah, right? I mean, you can't answer a question you don't know what it's asking. So we said, if this isn't clear, how would you phrase them? And she says, why didn't you just say, does he ever make you do things you don't want to do? Which, yeah, of course, right? But this is the importance of working directly with the women experiencing this violence in helping you figure out not only what you need to do, giving you the agenda for change, but also giving you giving input on how these things get put together, so that you don't have these unintended consequences. And then the answers to these questions, as you see in this next slide, give us this is just a partial list of all the things that show up in risk assessments.
Right. So Scott, just to talk about these just for a minute, and to talk about this time frame that we're all in, which is COVID, which is to think about really how have you seen any of these sort of play out differently, right? So in part, we want to give the message to you that that the risk factors haven't changed because of COVID, but the outcome of any sort of, assessment or, asking questions, because the social world in which we all live in is very different, right, than sort of pre-COVID. And so, like I was talking with a guy actually yesterday, he's now alone. His wife and kids left him, and he finds himself like just being obsessed about her. he just said, he's in our Batterers interventions group, and we're doing a COVID check-in now at the beginning. We have some standard questions that we're asking every week. Tell us about if your employment has changed, since last week, since we know that's a risk factor, right? So we're asking about that. And what we've seen over time, which is interesting, is that we've had some men get laid off, but most of them have had their hours reduced, right? So now we know what we know about that in our minds, about that being a risk factor, so we have to keep that with us in that way. But this is a guy who had his hours reduced. His wife left him with the kids. He has no idea when he's going to see him next. And he told us in group, I find myself, I can't go out and do the things I used to do, right? He used to, do some athletic things. He's like, I can't do those because of this. So I find myself sitting at home obsessing about her, right? Another sort of risk in terms of, I'm concerned he's going to start stalking her. So can you give some examples of how you're thinking about these risk factors, also doing Batterers intervention group and working with your system and thinking of, how these are playing out differently?
Yeah, so the risk factors are static. The threat to kill is a threat to kill is a threat to kill. That doesn't change. But the context in which that happens, we're seeing a shift. So we are tracking, we coordinate CCR, coordinated response in 2 different communities. And in both communities, we are tracking police reports, and we'll eventually come up with something written about this, but of all the different ways in which this pandemic is becoming part of the abuse. So an individual in one of the communities assaults his partner the night before. The next morning, she packs some stuff for her and her child and tells him that she is leaving to go live with her sister. And he pulls a gun out, threats to kill, firearms. He pulls a gun out, points it at her head and says, you're not leaving this house with my son and putting my son at risk of this virus, right? Well, another case, a woman had court-ordered visitation, and he denied her the spring break or 10 days of vacation time with her son because he said that the governor is locked down everybody and I can't bring the child for the exchange, which was absolutely not true. It was completely contrary to what the Minnesota Supreme Court had already said about prioritizing visitation with children, but that's what he was using, and he got away with it because there wasn't a remedy because the courts aren't hearing family law cases during a lockdown. So yeah, there's just a number of ways in which we've seen how abusers are using the pandemic. That we had recently on Friday, I think there was a case where the man broke into her home and was in her bedroom trying to find evidence that she'd been sleeping with somebody. When the police arrived to arrest him, he was sitting in the bedroom with his child in his lap, telling the officers that he was trying to protect his child from his wife's boyfriends who were coming over and sleeping with her and putting his child at risk for the virus. She wasn't sleeping with anybody. There was nobody there, but he was using that as an excuse to break into her home and tell the officers that he was, obviously trying to protect his child as opposed to actually putting the child at risk. So those are the contextual ways. And again, the reason we're tracking all that information is because we know that this pandemic is probably going to come back in some way, shape, or form later on. And we want to be better prepared as to how to respond so that we know more about what it's like for women who are living in this space right now and how these men are using the pandemic to their benefit to get what they want over her. Not sure if I answered your whole question there, but.
No, you did. But it's the way, it's been kind of the most common question I've been getting from doing a number of trainings and webinars is, what are you doing for risk assessment, right? And so in part what we're saying, is that now is, if you weren't doing them before, now's not the time to start to do them, right? Because for us as Batterers Intervention Program people, in St. Louis County near Duluth, I don't do them. They're done so beautifully in Duluth. I get the results of them, right? And I have a way now to interpret them because of the social conditions, right? Because I understand what it's like. And I want to read for those things, at this time. But in part, what we're saying is that, like, what we're doing at the beginning, each group is, asking those questions about, the employment, like I said, is one. Has your living situation changed? Are you still living with the same people you were last week? Has any of that changed? Those sorts of things. We had a guy just this week tell us he had a cousin who died of COVID, right? And he was really, really, down, right? So, Graham and I are doing that group. So Graham actually arranged for someone to have some contact with him, in between, because he was down. And also he was, it was interesting thinking about kind of this idea of like getting my way. And he was talking about how he has a 12-year-old at home. Him and his wife are both essential workers, and his 12-year-old is supposed to be doing schoolwork all day long, and of course doesn't. So it said, we come home from work, we're so tired. Our work is more stressful now. We just want to rest, and we're doing 12-year-old math, 6th grade math. It's the last thing I want to do, right? And so my first response is to scream and yell at my kid, right? Like, what you had all day, right? And so you just can see how it can play out differently. And for us, I think as practitioners, our job is to take our knowledge of these and take what we know and put them into our understanding, and also to talk with that woman at this time about what their experience is. Like, as you said before, we're going to have some understanding, but we're not going to really understand the deep understanding until we talk to women.
And my encouragement is that all of you in your communities document what you're learning about how offenders are using it and how victims are experiencing it, because those are going to be the foundations, hopefully, of building a different and new response that we have not thought of yet, because we don't know what it's like, because nobody's lived through this before. It's not good enough that your agency knows this information. Policymakers need to know it. People around the world need to know it. And the more, we just need to be a community that shares what we know. So it isn't just a handful of agencies that are doing this, in spotty places around the world. We all need to really share what we've learned and grow together on how to respond to this global crisis. Next slide, please. So you're going to get a excerpt of a police report from Duluth, just the part where the risk questions are being asked. And you're going to see when you get this, and this is a real report, both the risk factors that just come out as she's talking to the officer, that our staff member every morning uses to figure out the actuarial risk score. And we use the ODERA, which is the Ontario Domestic Assault Risk Assessment. That's what we use, and we use that because it only requires public data in order to complete it, so we can complete it efficiently, and there's a good level of accuracy to it. But the other thing that you're going to see when you read this police report is his entitlement. So one of the big questions the system always has, and defense attorneys always promote, is that this is just a one-off thing. This was just a bad night. There's no pattern to this violence. That this is not something that the court needs to take seriously. But when you read the answers to these questions, which give us a window into what it's like to live with him, and you'll absolutely will see this when you read it. When he says things like in this report, she reports that he tells her, "You had my baby. I can do anything I want to you. You have to do everything I say." And another point, she says, he likes control of his women. He tells me that my money is his money, right? Those are all messages of entitlement. And so now there's no question for the judge, for the pretrial release agent, for the prosecutor on who they're dealing with. This is a batterer, and her risk and all the risk factors we know about apply to this individual. This is not a one-off bad night. This is a pattern behavior, and it's been expressed by the victim and the answers to those risk questions. And they are invaluable to advocates, to everybody in the system, to understand what her risk is and what we need to do with him to manage the threat that he poses. All right, next slide. I just saw a question about adolescence, and I just want to jump that in.
Yeah.
So
Scott, just to know, it also came up earlier as well. So there are kind of two questions, because I had mentioned it at the beginning. But yeah.
So here's one of the things that was an interesting project in Duluth, where we have a incarceration reduction initiative. So trying to reduce the time people are spending in holding. And one of those initiatives was around adolescents and youth. And so one of the things that we did is we took 2 years worth of police reports where adolescents had been arrested and brought to detention around domestic assault. And when we sat down with police, advocates, juvenile detention staff, probation agents, advocates for youth, prosecutors, and social workers were on this team. And we took all those reports and we read through them. And the overwhelming consensus on the first read through was, I can see why the officer did what he did, but this wasn't a just result. And so I'll give you an example. A man starts drinking on a Saturday afternoon. The police report says that the 15-year-old boy went into the refrigerator, grabbed the remainder of the beer in a six-pack, and took it out to the porch and threw it at his father and said, "Why don't you just get effing drunk?" Because he knows where this Saturday is going to go. Somebody's going to get hurt, because this is what happens when he drinks. The father gets up and starts yelling at the son. Now, under our laws, everybody has a right to self-defense, and part of self-defense is to attempt to retreat. The young man retreated through the house. He retreated through the backyard, and now his back was up against the garage in the back of the house, and he knew his dad was going to hit him, so he hauled off and hit his dad first. And his dad walked over to the phone and said, "You're going to jail." And he called the police. The police came over. And in Minnesota, under our statutes, parents have a right to use reasonable force against an adolescent. There is no provision that allows for an adolescent to use any force in return. And so that's why the officer arrested this young man. So then what we did is we looked at all the addresses that these children were living at and ran them through the police database. And what we found was the average, this isn't the total, this is the average amount of police calls where they arrested an adult domestic abuser was 3 in the houses that these kids lived in. So these children were living in homes where there was all this violence. Then we went to the juvenile detention center and we started talking to adolescents about this dilemma of having an abusive parent or boyfriend in the house, and they're doing time. And I'm telling you, the only time I can say that I have felt like the air was so thick you could cut it with injustice is in a room full of women who've been arrested for being beaten by their partner. And that was the same in this room. They were saying things like, why am I doing time? Why is my freedom taken away when the guy who's beating up our whole family is running free? Like the hatred in these young boys' faces were just, it was heavy, right? So that's a little example of a project where, so now the Duluth police, if they get a call based on this project, they get a call to an adolescent who assaults a caregiver, so it's a domestic, they are by policy have to do a self-defense analysis to ensure that either party wasn't acting in self-defense. If anybody was, there's no crime. If self-defense doesn't apply to what happened, then they have to do a subsequent analysis to figure out who the predominant aggressor is. And that's the person that gets taken into custody. And then a patrol officer cannot arrest an adolescent at the scene without the approval of a sergeant. So they have to bring somebody else in from command in order to arrest an adolescent. That is the same provision that we have for adult victims who are experiencing ongoing violence. That's the same protocol that we applied to adolescents as a way to take up their experience as children experiencing violence from an adult and then using violence in return. So yeah.
I think one of the couple fascinating things about that project, one of which is that, you know, this was done within the city of Duluth, but then all it takes is to go to one surrounding county, right, or just across the water to the state, just to see how when you have a different policy, a different response, how many teens are getting brought in, right, to that same juvenile center from the other jurisdictions. So I'm saying part of what we saw is just a great reduction in the number of those arrests. I think the other thing that was really interesting, I just remember when it's one of the most fascinating projects I've been on, because in part, it also brought up a couple other things, one of which is the police, and we saw it in the reports too, where part of the way that the police were getting kind of caught up with the battering parent was kind of in this, the men who batter really found a way to connect with the police. So, you know, kids these days, right? They're really disrespectful. You know, my kid's disrespectful too. I'm sure you have a kid too, right? And the police really said, I realize now that I really got caught up in that, right? And that I really bought into his idea that the kid is the problem, right? And I found myself turning my focus there. But I remember seeing that in a number of the sort of reports. And then I think, you know, the other thing, just as it relates to your saying about sort of the intervention, you know, something that still needs to be worked on, I found fascinating, was then the intervention they used, right? All the intervention was focused on the kid, right? He had to go to individual therapy. He had to go to family therapy sometimes with the man who he'd witnessed beating his parents. And this teen also was told he needs to make better choices next time, right? He didn't make good choices, right? Which is a very sort of paternalistic way to intervene in a problem that's organized based in, oppression. It's not the way you deal with that problem, right? But that's right. The way it was being dealt with.
And then here's another outcome of these kids living in these homes where we're not dealing with the offender, we're dealing with the victim. Is that I'm sitting in a group of young men doing what we would call a men's group, a nonviolence group, with adolescent boys, and they were all 100% adamant that you never hit a woman. That's just, you don't do that. I've seen it happen to my mom. I would never do that to a woman. I think it was, they couldn't have stated it more strongly. So then I said, okay, let me give you a situation. You and your girlfriend are going to a movie at Tuesday matinee. You're supposed to be there at noon. And you decide, a couple friends of yours call, and you decide to go play at the local rec center with them, and you don't show up. So she's angry. She comes looking for you. She finds you at the rec center, and she calls you out. She calls you out in front of everybody and says, you know, where were you? Why the F didn't you show up, right? And one of the young boys said, well, she doesn't get to do that. I said, she doesn't get to? Or what? And his eyes got big and he said, oh, wow, look at that. Guys, look where we're at. Like, we're right there, right? And so, you know, as much as these boys were saying you don't hit a woman, this is the environment that they're growing up in. This is what they watch all the time. And until we deal with that offender, till we pull that influence out of the house, this thinking is getting ingrained in their heads. And it was one scenario, and they were all right there like, she doesn't get to do that, or what? Boom, there we are. So yeah, this is why this work is important if we want to save generations from perpetuating this problem. Okay.
Yeah, so there's just a little bit of a question too. So one of the person who asked the question got disconnected, but in part it was, what recommendation can I immediately recommend to the youth in my community? And so just to reiterate, part of what we're saying is that if you want to change a community's response, first you need to organize those who are being affected or impacted and find out what their experience is, right? So that would be the first, that's kind of the traditional Duluth response, which is to gather those who are being affected, in this case the teens, and hear from them, document, learn from their experience about the injustice they're experiencing, and then create a response based on the injustice that you hear from them.
Right. So I get calls all the time. Where should we start in our coordinated response? Where do we begin? And I said, this is Melissa said, talk to those you serve. Talk to the victims in your community, whether it's the adolescents or whether it's adult women, whoever is the victims that you're in your populations that you're working with. Talk to them about what it's like to live in your community with somebody who's doing this to them. And have you ever reached out for help? What was that? What was helpful about that? What was not helpful about that? That will give you an agenda. And I tell you, the other question I get is, how do you get these government agencies to be open to changing their policies? It's not because I am so good at what I do. It's because I can take to the chief and I can say, when your officers intervene in the lives of our fellow community members, this is what they're saying happens. This is not the goal. This doesn't fit the mission, right? How do we line up your mission to protect and serve with what the victims are saying is happening to them? How are we going to make the changes, right? And they will open up to that, right? Because that's not the goal. And most people in the government systems are blind to how they are making it harder for victims because they're just doing their job, right? Well, we need to do that job in a particular way. And that's where we as advocates can help.
Mm-hmm. Scott, there's another question I want to make sure we get to, which is tied to, does probation make themselves available during sleeping hours or when he's outside of the house, or are they just doing it 9 to 5?
No, there's somebody who's on call, got the red phone, so that if there's a call from law enforcement, say they go to a house at 2 in the morning and they find out that this guy's on probation and he's drunk, then somebody's on call for that officer to talk to and say, all right, I got Jim Smith, he's intoxicated and he's on probation. Do you want him taken into custody? Yes, that's a violation. We want him taken into custody. So yeah, there's somebody on call 24 hours. Yep. So if you go back one slide. Thank you. So we talked about data collection. Now we move to data analysis. Who's going to be the one who analyzes and puts this together? Now, the ODERA risk tool originally was designed for law enforcement to do that at the scene. As I said before, our law enforcement, we're asking enough of them. We're not going to have them put together and score something like this. So they're going to collect it, and then we brought in one of our staff people from DEIP, who then goes to the police department, downloads that report, and then she's the one who puts that together. And I think it's better in a couple different ways. One is, we're not asking the officers to do more than what we should be doing, and they're focusing on data collection. But the other thing is that if we had, in Duluth, we have 150 officers, that'd be 150 different ways of doing an assessment. And there's going to be a great range with how those are filled out. Now we have one person consistently putting them all together. That is a lot more consistent, reliable outcomes. And then the system ends up trusting those more because they are consistent. So that's how we ended up figuring out how to analyze that data. And then if you go to the next.
just say though that, when you say that a staff member of DIP, goes to the PD and do that, I mean, it took a lot of work just to get that to happen, right? That we understand that doesn't just happen. Like an advocate can't just go to the police chief and say, hey, I'd like a spot in your office and I want to get access to all your reports, right? I mean, I remember, when I was about the DIP, part of the arrangement, for example, at DIP, it was particular staff members got access to that. So even though I was, the executive director at the time, I didn't have any authority to just go there and say, well, I want to look at all the police reports, right? Like that was a negotiation that happened. So I just want to, say that because it's not common everywhere that's something that you have to get figured out.
Right. And so there's so much of what I'm talking about in this hour and a half. This is actually 4 days worth of training. So there's a lot that I'm glossing over about how we organize these things, but Melissa's correct. Pat Goodman, who does that work for DEIP, she has access to information that I don't have access to because she's got that position. She has a key to get into the police department. I don't have a key to get into the police department. If I want to go, I have to go to the front desk and have somebody escort me just like everybody else. So yeah, they are screened and they are supervised for compliance to the protocols and the data practices that are in place. And the one thing that we had to do in Minnesota to get this consistently is that we got a law passed by our state legislature that said that advocates, if you're a designated advocacy agency in the state of Minnesota, you get police reports upon request at no charge. So that's just a given. We're going to get those things. What we organize with our police department is how we get them. So rather than the police printing them and putting them on a desk for us to pick up, we actually have a desk at the police department that we go in and download them. And then we distribute them to the other advocacy agencies.
Mm-hmm. So Scott, I think there's two other questions here I think are important. One of which is, how do you handle situations in which women report a probation violation, but also ask that no probation notice take place? Yeah,
I mean, those are again, so here's another piece to this risk work that we're talking about. One of the things that we have found that is extremely helpful is to have a dedicated unit, a specialized team of probation agents that only supervise domestic offenders because they get really, really good at it. So all the things that you want those agents to be able to do, it's going to be hard for them if they're supervising a guy who's got a chemical dependency problem, a drug dealer, somebody who's gone there for theft, and then a domestic abuser. And so you want somebody who's really good at one of these things, and domestic abuse is so complex. That's why we want that particular unit. So here's an example. We're still dealing with this guy after a number of years, but he is a high risk offender. She called the agent who she had a good relationship with and said, he is being extremely scary. He's being abusive to me and the kids. He's not home right now. He's sleeping off at a friend's house, a hangover, because he's been drinking heavily. And we said, do you know who he's been drinking with? And the guy that he went out drinking with was the guy he sits next to in men's group. So what we did is, to keep her anonymity in this whole thing, is we sat down with probation and advocates, and this took us an entire day actually to pull this off. Supervisors were involved, and essentially what we ended up doing is calling in the buddy that he goes drinking with for a random UA. Well, he failed it because he'd been drinking the night before. So they said, who are you drinking with? And then he outed the guy. And he said, well, I've been drinking with so-and-so, right? So now we haul him in and we held him for about 4 hours at probation, which gave her time to get her kids packed up and ready to go. And she temporarily moved out of that house so before he got back there, right? So we held him on a technical violation, and he thought he was being compliant because he was thinking that if he stayed long enough and was compliant, he wasn't going to go to jail, right? Now, I just told that story in about 3 minutes, but that actually took hours of work, advocates, probation, and supervisors to figure out how to go about that and keep it safe. But that's the kind of collaboration and trust that we all have with one another, that we can figure out these things and brainstorm them together. Just like the example I told you about that we did on Friday with the woman who was invited to move out, but declined to do that with probation. That again was another advocate probation partnership where they called us and said, here's a high-risk guy, help us think through how to strategize around this. And then we do that as a team, because that's what we do. So that you know, if you have a probation agent who is saying, if she's going to give me this information, then I'm going to use it. You've got an agent whose priority is holding him accountable, not her safety. And that's exactly how I would talk about it, right? You are putting people at risk by what you're doing. There are ways around this, but you're not collaborating, you're not doing that. You're just taking the easy way out, which is to violate him. And that just puts victims at risk, and it alienates them from the system, which then makes it easier for him to be abusive to her. And you need to help people in the system see that that's how this plays out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a couple of questions here. One of which is, this is for you and I, for both the men's group, is what if he's in men's group and during group or in a private meeting with you, he tells you about the fact that he continues to abuse her, or that he has violated a probation condition, and it's a condition, right? Let's say it's drinking, right? Let's just take that, the easy one. Can you say a little bit about the role that BIP sort of takes on with that, and how you think about that, and would you contact her and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so it depends on the violation, right? So if he threatens to hurt her, I had a guy get up out of class, and he just stood up and he said, I didn't get ordered to this program the way the rest of you did by getting convicted of domestic assault, but I think I'm going to go do that. And then he walked out. Well, okay, class stops. We call her immediately. The other person calls the police, and they go looking for him. They intercepted him before he got home, but she had the time to get out. Like that, and they know that from the moment they come into our program. If you tell us about current violence that you're using against your partner, we are going to report it. Like there's not a question about that. Now on alcohol use or drug use, it's a little different. Now a guy comes in and I can smell alcohol on him, right? I want him to stay open to the rehabilitative process, right? I don't want to be his probation agent. I don't want him to look at me that way. I want him to be open in class, and I want him to expose his thinking and his behavior so we can work with it. And if I consequence him, then he might not want to do that. So what I do is I call up the probation agent and say just a tip, Tim Smith might want to just do a random UA if you haven't done one. And they don't know exactly what I mean, right? I'm not
right.
calling because it's Wednesday. I'm calling because there's a reason. And they'll immediately call up and say, hey, it's a random UA day. I need you to drop a sample off within an hour, right? Mm-hmm. Boom, there it goes. And so I preserve my relationship with him in a rehabilitation program, and he's held accountable for violating probation. Both things happen. So.
There's a question that came into me privately, so the rest can't see in the chat, but I'll just mention it, which is, can you say a little bit about, this person is monitoring, doing phone conference calls now, with men on a group phone conference call during COVID, and thinking about, what should they be monitoring, looking for, thinking about in terms of risk, and should they be providing that to women's advocates, that any information that comes up?
Well, so when men enter our program, they sign a release that has all the advocacy agencies on it. And we tell them, we're not going to just point blank send all this information that you fill out to the advocacy agency. But if we need to talk to them about concerning behavior that you're exhibiting in class, we are going to do that, right? So we're really clear up front. We also are very clear when they come into the program, they sign a contract for participation. In that contract, they have to write her full name into a blank line. And the sentence that line shows up in is that we will contact Ann Smith to provide her with your class time, who your facilitators are, and your attendance. And we will inform her of any impending court hearings. Like, we're going to tell her these things, and we want you to know that we're going to do that, so that he understands that he can't isolate the men's program from the rest of the system. Stunningly, they think that we don't talk. They think that the probation department doesn't talk to the police department, doesn't talk to the men's program. Like, we are all talking, and I want them to know that's how tight this net is that they're in.
Sorry, and part of the question also was, in addition to the known risk factors, are there any others that have come up for you that you thought, this is something maybe we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think isolation.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Men who are living alone.
Yeah, I mean, well, no, I mean, that, but also attempts at keeping her from anybody else. There's something he's holding on tight to, and the guys who are really extreme isolators, I find consistently dangerous. Like, those guys are the ones that commit some terrible forms of violence, and that's not a risk factor, but it's something I've seen happen time and again. Stalkers, that is a risk factor, but it's a lot more than that. That particular group of guys really stands out from some of the other guys. And again, along with stalkers, you could also mention those whose most of their violence is done sexually. Again, that's a different, higher risk guy than your average participant in a men's group. But those, stalking and sexual coercion are both risk factors, but those two risk factors aren't like the other ones in my experience, as far as how high that guy's risk is.
And I think, I've done some work in Australia, and I know there's some people on here from Australia. And part of what, when I was working with their men's groups, part of what I realized, and I remember saying this to the facilitators at one time, I said, sometimes I feel like you feel like accountability is all on you as the men's group. And they said, yeah. Right now, they had never told me that, but I kept just getting this feeling and notion from them. And when I think about that now, right, this question makes more sense to me, because if I can't imagine being in a community where I can't count on the police, or I can't count on the probation, right, to do their job. Because as I've heard you say, Scott, and I said too, is that I need them to hold them accountable outside of the room, so that I can have them hold themselves accountable in the room, right? But I couldn't imagine trying to hold the weight of both, right, in that.
Yeah, you can't. No. So just when you're thinking about accountability, the system is organized to, as Melissa says, impose accountability. That's how they get to victim safety, right? And I need them to do that job, right? But when we get them into a rehabilitation program, we're creating a space where they can hold themselves accountable for what they've done. Our process is very different from their process, but they won't stay in our process if they don't have that process of accountability hanging over their head, right? So these two definitions of versions of accountability work together very well to keep men in a program that they would not stay in if they didn't have to. Yeah. All right, so we go to the next slide. After we've analyzed the data, now we got to figure out how to get it from each agency. So the police department, how do we get that risk information to flow through the police department, so it always ends up at Pat's desk. That took a lot longer than you might think to reroute how police reports go through the department. Once it gets to Pat, then it goes to an investigator who reads it for compliance. Pat reads it for compliance, documents the divert risk information, goes to an investigator. They put it together in a packet that goes to the prosecutor. Pat sends it to the court, the judge who will be overseeing the first appearance, and then also sends it to the pretrial release agent. So the whole idea of what we've tried to do with risk is that nobody who's making a decision on this offender is making it from risk information that other people don't have. Everybody has the same information, the same basis of risk that they're making decisions from. And then that risk file that we put together on him follows him through the system. And when if he's convicted and he's on supervised probation at the end of that process, that file now ends up in that probation agent's hands, and they continue to build and add to that to manage this guy's risk. Because how he was assessed, his risk level that he was assessed at when he got arrested might be very different 3 months later when he's been convicted of that crime. So your risk tool needs to have flexibility, and it's really a dynamic process of managing his risk as it changes through time. He could be low risk in the beginning, and then she decides to leave him, and now his risk goes through the roof, right? So does our response has to be able to adjust to that. So, okay, I think we're
So we have
close to
just
the end
a couple
here.
more minutes, Scott. Yeah. So do you
So
want
is there any
questions?
questions?
Yeah, so there is another question here. So the other question is about just thinking about how, just kind of how isolation that life imposes, not him, and our domestic violence programs reaching out with the partners of group members who are willing to help them break out of the COVID isolation when the isolation is caused by the COVID. What's that sort of reach out to? How's that happening with victims?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I can't tell you what it's going to be right now because we are just we called all the men in the program. We found out which men are not living with their partners. So now we know the group of women we can call without having to worry that he's there, right? So that's going to be a really helpful when we now call the victims and gather the information from them as to what they would advise, given the social isolation that everybody's experiencing, as to what we should do with the women who are still with their partners. Like what's their experience as women living in this right now with a partner who's not in the home, but who's still out there and abusive. And what would they tell us to do with the women there? I can't tell you what that is yet because I don't know. But that's the information we're going to be collecting going forward and how we're going to collect it. So if you've got somebody who does men's programming, this should be one of the first things that they do is poll the guys with a number of different questions. And one of them is, do you live alone? Yes. No, I don't live alone. Who lives with you? My brother. Okay, now we know. Do any kids live with you, right? I mean, this should be information that we're collecting so that we know who we can get to first. And then they give us advice on how to call the rest of the women. But I think it's going to be difficult. I think everybody's experiencing that because of the lockdown that we're living under. So.
And just to mention one risk factor that we haven't talked about, Scott, which I think is one that's not as commonly known, which is having a non-biological child in the home. That's a known risk factor for lethality, actually. Then it's one that people thought, how could that be? How could just having, that child in the home? So that's in part why we ask about other people being in the home. So I just want to mention that one as well. But Scott, do you have any comments about that lastly, and any last thoughts, because we're at the end of our time?
No, again, I'll just reiterate for everybody on the call, if there's a way for your agency that you work for to collect what you learn, this is, as I said, this is unprecedented. None of us have ever lived through this before. Many of us who are advocates have been caught unprepared for this. And I can raise my hand and say we are one of those places. That we wish we had an alternative means of communicating with victims other than the phone, because or texting, because that isn't always working. One of the things that I've heard and that we're starting to use is fake Facebook accounts and communicating through Messenger. That seems to be something that other places are using successfully. So yeah, document what you learn, share what you know, and help all of us get better the next time we have to face anything that's remotely like this. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Scott. We appreciate your time. And just a reminder that on May 1st, Scott and I are going to be back with John Heath to talk more. That time we're going to talk just about men's groups, not just about risk in the CCR, but just kind of what we've learned during this time of COVID and how we're thinking about it. So we will be doing that on May 1st. So you're welcome to sign up there. But I am going to shut off the record function now. I want to thank everyone for your time and participation. And you will get a copy of the PowerPoint sent to you and also a copy of the recording.
Thank you.